Nomai Haramai, Kiraro Ite, Korowai, Orangi Maria. I'd like to give you a big welcome to everyone. So as Christine mentioned, this is the second session of Aspen Institute Summer Series on the geopolitical challenges. And so 2 weeks ago, we talked about Indo-Pacific, and today we'll focus on North Asia. And then it will be followed by a talk on the great power rivalry. So for those of you who will be joining all of these 3 sessions, you will have great opportunity to actually build up your thought and insights and perspectives that you will learn from different people. So it's such a great opportunity, I think. So before we actually move on to our core part of the conversation and corridor, I'd like to suggest to have a think about what we mean by North Asia. Are we on the same page? From a geographical perspective, when you hear the term North Asia, what kind of countries do come to your mind? Maybe
Japan, Korea, and China.
Japan, Korea, China, thank you. Yeah, and we have 2 Koreas actually, North Korea and South Korea. What else?
Well, I mean, surely Russia would be included.
Russia, definitely. Geographically, it's part of North Asia, thank you. And we also have Mongolia. And also, I know some people feel that, whether, the question of whether Taiwan is an independent country or not is a controversy. But let's set it aside, but Taiwan is geographically often included as a part of the region. But also from a geopolitical perspective, I think we shouldn't forget the strong presence and influence from the United States. The United States has been having a strong presence, particularly from the end of the Second World War, and has been still one of the key countries that have been determining the geopolitics in the region. So I hope when we talk about North Asia today, I hope you just have these kind of countries in mind. But our conversation will not really limit to this particular region, but we also include some of the countries in vicinity areas like Southeast Asia and even South Asia, depending on the topic areas that we are going to cover today. And in this regard, I'm honored to actually have these 2 distinguished speakers who will cover the various kind of topics that we are going to talk about. Firstly, John McKinnon. Probably many of you already know him. He is a very well-known diplomat of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Since he had joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1974, he has been posted to many countries like Australia, the United States, and the United Nations in New York, and he also has served as a Secretary of Defense. But probably most relevant to today's talk is his presence in Beijing. Firstly, in 1978 as the second secretary, and then in 2001 as the New Zealand ambassador, and again as the second term in 2015 as the ambassador as well. So that's John. And Simon, also a very well-known diplomat. I'm sure that many of you know him. And he has a long career as a diplomat, working for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs since 1991. Recently, he had served as the director of United Nations Human Rights and Commonwealth Division. And while delivering this service, he played a key role in New Zealand's campaign for securing a UN Security Council seat. And since 2015, he is the executive director of Asia New Zealand Foundation. May I suggest a big welcome to the speakers today. Thank you so much for coming along. So now, my first question is actually really to offer the foundation for our further corridor. So the question is, what are the key driving forces that change the regional dynamics of North Asia? What issues do the countries in this region concern most? May I invite Simon first?
Yeah, thanks very much, Professor Lee. Hi everyone, great to see you. Let me on behalf of our panellists apologise. It's a manel, wasn't planned that way. We did want to have Anna here, but she's left us, so you're stuck with us, I'm afraid. Christine's been really clear, concise, don't talk too much, but I did warn her. The first thing, I'm a little bit loquacious just for this first question. because I have many idiosyncrasies, but one is, I think, context really counts. So when I speak, I'm from the Asia New Zealand Foundation. Mainly we help New Zealanders understand Asia, but we have 12 dialogues between diplomats, academics, all sorts of people across the region. So when I speak, it's not sort of what I think, it's what I've heard. So a lot of the views about what's happening in North Asia are going to come from these dialogues. The second thing is my personal view, is that we are not in a period of global uncertainty. Well, we are in a period of global uncertainty, but it's more that we have exited a period of remarkable stability. That 1945 to 2015, thereabouts, 2012, was remarkable in human history for a relatively clear rules-based order. You know, if you've got a problem, you go to the UN or the WTO or wherever. That's gone, in my view. And the world that we are in now is going to be permanent. You know, it's going to be for the foreseeable future. So, when I say these things, it's from that worldview. Continued instability, and this is what people tell me. The other thing I want to do, very quickly, Christine, is Asia. I still can't get my head around it. So the most important people in the world are millennials, right? These people here, because they're the ones who are going to invent things and work and pay our pension, all that. There are 800 million millennials in Asia. Asia, for me, is Indonesia to Pakistan. There's 66 million millennials in Europe and 60 million in the United States. So there's more than 10 times as many young people here. So in India, which you talked about, India has to create 1 million new jobs every month. There's 1 million Indians turning 18 every month. Okay? And I find this, of the 100 cities that are facing climate change, adaptation and mitigation and are most at risk, 99 are in Asia. And the other bit is, New Zealand now is a much more Asian country. 24% of New Zealanders identify as being Asian. And a Māori Pacifica, an Asian population, will outnumber the Pākehā European population by about 2040, I think it is, 2030, not that far away. So that's the context. So your question, which I'm finally getting to, was what are people worried about? Well, this is what we've been told by not only the people engaged, but also their advisors. The first thing they said to us is that after COVID, much of Americas, Africa, and this is pre-Ukraine, will look the same, but that at the moment there are some deep fractures happening in Asia, and that the Asia post-COVID is going to be quite different. And they put that down to 3 or 4 things. The rise of Japan. Japan's activism, stepping into the TPP, its militarisation, has deep, deep issues for many North Asians. And there's a lot of talk about, is this a good thing or a bad thing? A lot of Southeast Asia is managed through ASEAN, and what's happening in Myanmar, potentially, I mean, people always think ASEAN's broken, but that Myanmar and the client states in ASEAN are going to break it. The great power rivalry that we're going to touch on. It was in the paper, it was in the Dominion today. There's an African saying, you know, when elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. But there's a Korean saying, which is, when whales fight, the shrimp's back gets broken. So essentially that means there's lots of collateral damage when big powers have conflict. And that's a real concern for the Koreas, North and South, Taiwan's and Japan's of this world. There's a sense that Asian cohesion that has been building over decades is fracturing, that Asians are feeling less sort of connected to the region. They're much more sort of nationalistic than Asian. And the final thing is that there's no part of the world that's benefited from globalisation in the last 40 or 50 years in Asia. Korea was an aid recipient of New Zealand till 1974, and now look at them. Look at Singapore, look at Japan. Globalisation's been fantastic, and that is slowing down. You know, there's no doubt that the idea that we're all working to lower the cost of doing business at the border, that's not the way of the future. And they've got big demographic issues, and I think the Indians say demographic is destiny. So they've got big demographic issues. So if you ask me, what are people talking about in Asia, about what's worrying them, this is what we're told is worrying thinkers and policymakers in Asia. Thank you.
Kia ora. Thank you. John, could you?
Well, thank you. Kia ora tātou, and well, I should say probably dajia hao, which is the Chinese way of saying hello to everybody. And I do want to just amplify your very nice account of my career, because I was also the ambassador to Mongolia. So I was the ambassador to China and simultaneously the ambassador to Mongolia. So if anybody wants to ask me a question about Mongolia, they're very welcome to do so. Now, Simon and I have come to an informal agreement that we will madly agree with one another, which will be very boring for the rest of you. But and I do in fact agree with a lot of what he said, but I will just add a few other points, because this is in response to the question which was asked about what are the big issues facing North Asia. And here I will in fact use the sort of China, Korea, Japan framing that you used, and with all due respect, I don't know anything about Russia, so I will not be able to say anything about that anyway. But if you look at that region, I think two things stand out. One, which Simon alluded to, is the sheer numbers. And I think it's very, very hard in this country to get our heads around this. I used to do visits when I was in China. I would go to provinces and cities, and I would say, well, you know, New Zealand has 5 million people, or it was 4 million then, I think. Now, there is a particular thing that happens, I don't know whether it happens in Korean, but it happens in Chinese, where you count in 10,000s, which means it's quite difficult to do a translation from our numbering system to theirs, so that you could see them dance out, oh, he actually means 40 million. Then I would say, and we have 27 million sheep, and they'd say, oh, he actually means 2.7 million. But actually, I was right and they were wrong. Unfortunately, we had far more sheep than people. But it was, you know, it was hard for them to understand that a country of 4 or 5 million people carried a weight in the world which was actually as much as, you know, any part of any country, even though China has 1.4 billion people. You know, we were a rounding error in many of the places that I went to. And I think part of the nexus between China and New Zealand is a recognition that actually a country of this size can actually do quite a lot in the world, even though by Chinese standards it's quite diminutive. But so the aggregate numbers are always things which are quite difficult for us to get our heads around. So, you know, 1.4 billion people, or if you add in Japan and the Koreas, you're talking probably 1.5 or 1.6 billion. You know, it's more than Europe and America combined. It stands up comparison with, you know, India or with Southeast Asia, but it's just the sheer volume of people. The second thing I think that's worth mentioning is that is the distinction or the division that's existed between China on the one hand and the sort of non-Chinese Japan, Korea in this instance, world on the other. And this actually dates back to 1950, which is very reassuring for me because it means within my lifetime, which is not true of most things we're going to talk about. But in fact, the Korean War was the moment at which the lines were drawn, which we're still grappling with today. The boundary between North and South Korea, the boundary between mainland China and Taiwan, the positioning of Japan as a loyal ally of the United States, all of these things actually date back to 1950, although they have acquired and they've had different significances over the years. And that actually is now something that we are confronting in a way which we probably had not had to confront for quite some time. And the countries, you know, so Korea and Japan, the Republic of Korea and Japan, they have their views about what's happening in China and vice versa. The Taiwan issue is something we'll probably come to a bit later. There are all these things which are bubbling bubbling away there, and they are issues and problems which we here in New Zealand have to have some sort of sense about and response to. And that's actually quite hard because, as Simon has said, we have lived in a world in which things were reasonably stable. I'm not sure they seemed stable at the time, but in retrospect they seem very stable. Now everything seems to be up for grabs, and I think that makes it much harder for a country like ours to navigate its way through the system. So that's my first response. I'm sorry, I've probably gone over my whatever allotted time.
Very concisely, Simon, if you have any other things to add to John's comment, please feel free to do so. And also, I wonder whether you mentioned that things became slightly unstabilized since 2015. For the people who may not be aware of what happened at that time, can you just explain what that
I left out China because I know John will speak about it, but of course one of the things people are talking about in North Asia is China. Having said that, and as John alludes to, they've been talking about China for 3,000 years, right? So I think often we need to think about, it's the conceit of every generation to think that this moment is particularly special, so that I'd say that. I would argue, and actually I'm repeating this from a vice president of the ADB who I met today, who was very impressive. He said, 2008, the global financial crisis, really tested some of our ideas about debt, tested our ideas about neoliberal economics, really not broke the system, but tested it in a way hadn't been tested since 1929 or the Great Depression. 2012, Xi Jinping was elected, and we got a change from, hide and bide your power, whatever it was that Deng Xiaoping said, to we're muscular. We've had 100 years of embarrassment or whatever it is. That's about to change, So you had a muscular, and then in 2015, I think it was 2015, we had the election of Donald Trump, which for a lot of people outside and in this part of the world really broke some ideas we had about America's role and America's sense of democracy. So within a period of 8 years, you had a financial shock, you had Xi Jinping, and then you had an America acting in a way that we just hadn't anticipated. And those so in 8 short years, you had some big shocks, and we're still feeling them today.
Thank you very much, Simon. Keeping those points in mind, now I'd like to actually move on to a little bit of more specific topic areas. So my next question is, so what's going on in the US-China relationship at the moment? So what is US trying to achieve, and how is China responding to it? And also, what is the Chinese issue? Where is it? Is placed in this dynamic? Can we start from John?
Well, these are the sort of questions that really I didn't want to be asked, but anyway, and I'm now, of course, like everybody in this room, a world expert on balloons, so I'm sure you'll forgive me if I don't actually talk about balloons, because I think that's probably going to be a bit distraction. I think it's worth, to be serious, it's worth thinking in terms of larger issues, in terms of the relationship between the United States and China, and there are two sort of aspects of that I would like to touch on. One is what Simon alluded to, which is the international rule of law. In other words, the systems whereby countries connect with one another, relate to one another, and resolve their differences. And quite clearly, in Washington and Beijing, there are different views as to what that is. And so, on the one hand, the United States is very strong that it's an upholder of the current system. On the other hand, we have spokespeople in China saying, well, by shooting down the balloon or whatever it was, the United States has breached international law. So there's a sort of an argument going on between these two very powerful countries, and I'll come back to that in a second, about exactly what are the systems and what are the rules that should be governing the behaviour of nations. Secondly, I think there is an issue relating to the relative power of the two countries. Now, I am not a fan of Thucydides, and if some of you will know about Thucydides and the so-called Thucydidean trap, which is about what happens with a rising power comes up with status quo power, and it goes back to a history that Thucydides wrote in the 5th century BC about Sparta and Athens, and his thesis, which has I think been somewhat misrepresented, was that basically Sparta feared the rise of Athens because it feared, regardless of what Athens stood for, that it was going to diminish the power of Sparta. So there are many people who say this is the situation that we're facing between the United States and China. I would say that's a little bit too simplistic, but I think there is an element in which if you sit in Washington and you look out at the world, there's only one country which could conceivably challenge you, and if you sit in Beijing and look out at the world, there's only one country which can constrain what you're going to do. And so there is a sort of built-in sense that those two countries, and they are two of the most powerful countries in the world, are in a sense innately uncertain about the motivations of the other. Now, what the balloon issue points to, and this is why I want to not talk about balloons, about its deeper meaning, is that there is massive lack of trust between the two sides. I think that's the obvious conclusion to be drawn from the sequence of events which have taken place over the last few weeks, so that there is a sense in which it doesn't matter what each side does, the other side is going to interpret it negatively. And for a country like ours, that's a very, very difficult situation to confront, because what it means is that the two countries, which are very important for this country and have very different systems, political, legal, social and other, they are in a sense at odds with one another. And, we don't expect that they're necessarily going to agree on everything, but it would be good if they find a way of connecting with one another. So regardless of what one thinks about the balloon episode, the fact is that now it seems we're into an even darker period of nexus between those two countries than we have had before. And I would like to think, as a New Zealander and as somebody who's professionally engaged with China, that we can find a way out of it. At the moment, I think it's quite difficult. I mean, if you're sitting in Beijing and you see that the US Congress or the House of Representatives has passed a unanimous resolution condemning what China did, well, that's not going to make you feel very warm about the United States. And equally, some of the things which have been coming out of the spokespeople from the Foreign Ministry in Beijing, it's not going to make people in America feel very happy about China. So it's a very, very difficult situation. We did have a meeting between President Biden and President Xi Jinping in Bali, I think it was in November last year, which I think was good that it happened, and it was promising, and that's why it was particularly unfortunate that the outcome of this episode was that the Secretary of State Blinken did not go to Beijing as had originally been scheduled. So maybe in due course things will be picked up again, but certainly at the moment it's a very difficult situation. So I think for both those countries, when they look out at the future, they're a bit anxious about what that future may hold. And anxiety is never a very good place to base your policy on.
Thank you.
So that's where I would stay at the moment. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
So it's probably still too long.
Yeah, so the trap in the Thucydides trap is that it always ends in war. That's why it's called a trap. What I can tell you is that what New Zealanders worry about in the great power relations is that A, will be collateral damage, and B, that an argument about the discussion about Asia, which primarily in New Zealand has been an economic discussion, is going to flip to a security one. And that will just be, and the people who are really worried about that is the New Zealand diaspora of Asian people. They really worry that they're going to be they're going to be ended up being talked about as a threat, a security threat. So that's what we're told. This is a gross oversimplification, but I think, again, context is important. So 1989, Francis Fukuyama wrote this book, The End of History, and it basically said, liberal Western democracy has triumphed. Cold War's over, Russia's collapsed. We have a unipolar superpower, and that's the United States. At the same time as that was happening, the engagement of the West with Asia, North Asia, had been, Japan was under Hirohito, essentially military. Korea was Park Chung-hee, military. Taiwan was Chiang Kai-shek, military. So the idea was that if we engage with them economically, out of this would burst this sort of democracy. And it sort of worked. Worked in Japan, worked in Korea, worked in Taiwan. And the idea was this is going to work with China. That if their income's raised, they're going to start delivering freedoms. And at some point, and there's a long discussion, a decision was made that was a fool's errand, that that's not going to happen. That China, the CCP, is going to keep control forever. I personally think that's a really important discussion to have, and I'm not a China expert. So that's why I think there's this tension. First of all, America, thought it was predominant, and then you've got this rising power, and then as John says, all those things come out of it. What it means for New Zealand, though, there's two things I would say. The good news, that was the bad news. Good news, we're not alone. Everyone in the region is dealing with this. China is the major trading partner of 9 out of 10 countries in Asia. Everyone's trying, and a lot of them have been doing it for a long time. Vietnam has been juggling the China-US relationship for decades. Singapore, there are other countries in this situation. And what does it mean for New Zealand is I think we have to be a bit cleverer and a bit more proactive in who are our like-mindeds. I think there's power in a union. There's power in us being with other countries who are confronting the same issues. And the final thing is that, and what we should do is do what we always do, which is maximise our own interest. I mean, that's the purpose of foreign policy. MFAT's thing is richer, more prosperous and safer New Zealand. That's the job. So I think that's what it means for us is some of the architecture or some of the ways we used to act are going to have to be adapted for this great power, but we're not alone, and we can, if we're smart, we can find people to work with.
Thank you, Simon. So John, based on that point, how has New Zealand have tried to mobilize the network of these like-minded countries? What was the kind of key line that New Zealand had taken so far?
Well, I think there's a variety of ways in which a country like ours, New Zealand, acts in the world, and the like-minded, which is now a very commonly used phrase, but can also mean different things depending on who you define as your like-minded. But I would say that as a general proposition, New Zealand's voice is going to be louder if it's sitting alongside other countries who share similar views. So, and that may not necessarily be people that automatically think of other countries, English-speaking countries, but it may mean countries again in Asia who, as Simon says, everybody's faced with this issue of how do you balance between your links in one direction and your links in another, because those links are not going to evaporate. Can I just pick up on one point which Simon said, which I will clarify, which is about the move to democracy. I don't think that was ever actually an idea that was of meaning in China in terms of its own direction. So I think there was a degree of thinking outside which said, oh, well, this must be the automatic consequence of an increase in income levels and standard of living, that you would then move to people saying, well, actually, we need greater political representation. And I mean, there is a movement within China which in a sense has some echoes of that. But if you look at the country as a whole, I don't think that was actually ever a particularly accurate perception of what was going on.
I think it was a Western hope.
Yeah. It may have been, I hope, may have been an aspiration, but I'm not sure it was actually something which resonated in terms of the population in that country itself. But on the other hand, what's also happened is that we've seen a build-up in some of the power and the capability in China itself. That's probably made more of a difference, I would say, than the change in the formulation of the way China goes about doing its business.
Right, John. Yeah. Now let's turn our attention to slightly different areas, like the relationship between Japan, South and North Korea. What is happening now? Because up until 2022, I think the relationship could be defined like between North and South, there has been a very early sort of detente, but now has been more in the status quo. But between Japan and Korea has been a little bit troublesome. But now, under the combination of Joe Biden government in the United States, Yoon Suk-yeol government in South Korea, Kim Jong-un in North Korea, and Kimi Fukuda in Japan. So what does it mean? What's going to happen? Do you have any thoughts to share?
Yeah, well, this is, so I'm a bit, if any of you join the foreign ministry and someone says you're angular, that's code word for you're not cut out for this job. And on Korea, I'm a little bit angular. And I've already apologised to Professor Lee in advance because, firstly, I should say, your first posting is like your first love. You never forget it. And mine was Korea. So I went to Korea in the early 90s. John was my boss and sent me off there. And I did 2 years Korean language training where I sat down with a Korean every day for 2 years and spoke to them. And then I did 2 years trying to do beef access. So so Korea's been something that I'm very interested in. And when I got this question, I thought, oh God, I've got a Korean here, how am I going to answer it? So I'm going to answer it truthfully from my perspective, and I fully encourage Professor Lee to disagree with me. I think it's hard for anyone in this room to appreciate the deep mutual loathing between Koreans and the Japanese. It goes both ways. It's population-wide, and it goes back millennia. It goes back thousands of years. If you ever go into Seoul and you look at a building, it translates into this was burnt down by the dirty Japanese in 1300, and we rebuilt it, and then it was burnt down again by them again 300 years later, and we rebuilt it. And that loathing is weaponized by the governments. So they use it as a way to get the population up and angry. So over an issue, one of hundreds, Uniqlo, Japanese department store, Koreans just don't go. Closed down, pulled out, because there was an issue over something. So my own view when I saw this question is, I don't think a Biden-Yoon thing is fundamentally going to change that. In the Korea, South Korea, Japan, it's about temperature, and it goes up and down. And it's probably a little bit down at the moment, but tomorrow there could be something unexpected where it will go up again. On the DPRK, this is a point I often try to make. The first thing I'd say, history is going to judge us incredibly badly on the DPRK. I mean, I don't understand how the Holocaust happened, and I think future generations will say, how could you let what's happening in the DPRK happen on your watch? I just think it's atrocious what happens there. They've had nuclear weapons there for 30 years now, right? Early 90s. New Zealand actually was part of CATO, the first when Clinton was trying to talk the DPRK out of getting nukes. The only thing that's changed recently is the delivery mechanism. So now it cannot just reach Japan or South Korea, it can reach possibly Guam or possibly the west coast of the United States. That's the change. It's not that they've got nukes, it's just that they can deliver them into the US. And Professor Lee will know this, 1970s, Daejeon Science Park, which it's called now, was a nuclear research unit for South Korea. When I studied on the American military base, I was told it was 19 days between South Korea deciding it wanted a nuclear weapon and getting one. Because they have the technology, obviously, and they have nuclear power. So I think I think one of the things that we should think about on the Korean Peninsula is it's been in this terrible situation for a long time. It's a wicked problem. It's very hard to see a way out of it. I do think some of the, I mentioned Japan's reassertion. I think that causes a lot of anxiety in Korea. And if anything, it pushes them more towards the Chinese, because they deeply worry about Japan. When I was there, they did a survey of young university graduates. What's the number one thing you worry about? This was in the 90s. Number one thing they worried about was Japan. Number two, I can't remember, it was like air quality. Number three was, and what? And you say, well, really, they're pacifists, come on. They go, no, you guys don't know. Look at their 3, 4, 5,000 year history. This is going off topic, doesn't matter. I think the ambition, in a way, in my view, for that correct DPRK, South Korea, Japan, I think the best we can hope for, unless you're one of the 20 million North Koreans who live in a Kafkaesque hellhole, the best thing you can hope for is the status quo. Because there's no good real outcome. They will never denuclearise. China will never always wants a buffer state between them and the DPRK. And I think it's...
ROK.
I think it's a really, ROK, sorry. So I think it's a really, so I'm not optimistic that the personal interventions of Biden, Kishida and President Yoon are going to really change that dynamic.
Thank you, Simon. What's your response?
Well, of course, I madly agree with Simon. But it's interesting, I've heard this from people, if you go from Japan to the Republic of Korea, you think it's very like China. If you go from China to the Republic of Korea, you think it's very like Japan. So there is a sense in which, Korea sadly sits itself between these two large countries, and I think that's been one of the challenges, and it makes us actually forget that Korea itself is actually quite a large country and a big economy. If it was in our part of the world, it would dwarf Australia. But actually, because it's up there between Japan and China, people sort of forget that Korea is actually itself quite significant. Secondly, I would say that, yes, from a Chinese perspective, of course, they don't see themselves in any way threatened by the DPRK. Now, there may be things the DPRK does which they don't especially like, but they know that whatever's going to happen, they're not going to turn whatever it is on China itself. And that brings about a very different dynamic in terms of the relations between both China and the DPRK and China and the ROK. When I was in Korea, which is now quite a while ago now, I think it was probably just in 2014 when I was in the role that Simon now has, Xi Jinping was making his first visit to Republic of Korea, and interestingly, at that time, he had not been to the DPRK, and I think that was the first time a Chinese leader had gone to the South Korea first instead of going to North Korea. Now, things have altered a lot since then, but I think that, there is a sense in which China looks at the Republic of Korea as in a sense, a more productive partner than maybe it does at the DPRK, but from a strategic point of view, the DPRK is a crucial part of China's outlook. So that in itself makes for an interesting dynamic between those three players, without even bringing Japan into the equation, which makes it even more complicated.
I'll be corrected on this, but I think there was a historical quirk. Mao Zedong's son was killed in the Korean War on the Chinese side, right? And so there was always this idea in South Korea that, while the old guard was around in China, given Mao Zedong's son had died, it held a special sort of place in there.
Well, I mean, I've got a DVD at home which is about the Chinese Korean War veterans. So you might think this is a bit odd, but these are actually the Chinese who went and fought. They call them the Chinese People's Volunteers on the side of the North Koreans in 1950-51, and Mao's son was part of that group, and it was the people going to fight find the graves of those soldiers who had died in that conflict. So it was a reminder that you know that this was a conflict which had costs on both sides.
But you're the Korean. So what do you think?
Well, just coming from, I just had a 6-week stay in my hometown in South Korea, and just came back. And just adding to your point, Simon, what I'm now curious is whether or not South Koreans actually want more reconciliation with Japan at this stage. Because when we actually want some reconciliation, we really need to start from our willingness to understand their counterparts. What I see as a Korean, the discourse within South Korea that is going on is that, okay, Japan, we are willing to be your friend, but only when you put down every narrative that you have and say that, sorry, what we did is completely wrong. So only you agree with us, we can be friends. So are we really willing to take one step further, to really recreate a reconciliation with Japan? That's my first point. And second point, vis-a-vis North Korea, now the people's concern becomes more serious because President Yoon Suk-yeol of South Korea recently made a repeated statement that the unification can come a lot quicker than what we are prepared for. And then it may include the early collapse of North Korean regime. And then now, coincidentally, we saw that Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, is taking his daughter, who is very young, on the main stage when they have a very big event, which many people interpret as his effort to really identify her as the successor if something happens to him. So many people suspect that it's a kind of maybe an indirect sign that Kim Jong-un may have a critical health issue or something else. So now it is actually raised quite strong concern within the South Korean population. I just want to stop there because we have other very interesting questions to talk about. Sorry. Now we are moving to economic part. North Asia is one of the most important economic and trade partners for New Zealand. And people in this regard recently have expressed their concern, the increasing protectionism emerging in the region. And other people also expressed their concerns about China's quite strong, heavy involvement to other economies, including the Pacific Island, right? Using the Belt and the Road policies. Right, yeah. How do you see it? So, what's the impact to New Zealand and the Pacific overall? Can we start from Simon?
Yeah. Let me start by saying, I meant to say this a couple of good. That's why I think these things really need to be talked about, and that's why I'm really grateful for you guys to come in tonight and having this conversation, because I don't think we have enough of them in New Zealand. And I think we really need them, because I think there's going to be some really tough choices coming up, and I think the New Zealand public need to be better informed than they are. So, 7 out of 10 of New Zealand's largest trading partners are in Asia. We're in the worst business, agricultural exports. If you had to choose a terrible business, that would be it. Many of a lot of the access that we get has been hard fought. Years of dry negotiations that John and I and others have been through. It's really tough. There's a lot of protectionist instinct globally, but North Asia's no exception, particularly around agriculture, because there are some cultural sort of yearnings for the old days, and that means farmers and things like that. One of the things that my organisation has heard as we go around is supply chain resilience. The pandemic's taught us we need supply chain resilience. Well, what does that mean? I have a fear that in a number of places that will be what we call in foreign policy trade speak technical barriers to trade. They're basically, yes, you can sell your product, but it has to have these sort of health and safety stuff. I think things like ban on tariffs at the border on carbon and stuff, I think they have the potential to be really harmful for New Zealand. So I think I worry quite a lot about how this plays out across Asia and particularly across North Asia. The BRI, and John and I were both at the second BRI meeting, I think, in Beijing.
Possibly, yes.
My view is it's not an economic thing. It's a political and security mechanism. I mean, essentially the Chinese narrative is the 1945 rules we didn't get to write. So we need to write some of our own. And so one of the ways to do that is we don't like the OECD Development Aid, DAC it's called, Development Aid Committee. We don't like the way they do that. We think it's rich countries and it's a chateau in Paris, mainly run by Scandinavians. We think we have a better model of development. And also we don't like this sort of we like hub and spokes where we're at the centre and we deal one-on-one. So we're going to do the Belt and Road. We're going to give you this, we're going to work with you. We understand what it's like to be in a different, but it's all about growing their influence, just like we did in the West. Many of you won't remember a thing called Jubilee 2000. Jubilee 2000 was when the OECD countries forgave the debt that we had loaded up on countries. And yet we were saying the BRI, it's about loading up debt. It's just what we did. So I think the BRI, I know in New Zealand we kvetch about it, we worry about it quite a lot. I went, in Beijing, I was sitting next to my Lao colleague and I said, he said, why are you here? And I said, well, we're trying to work out if it's an agreement or an arrangement because these things are important. I said, why are you here? And he said, well, we've got 300 kilometres of railway and we just need another 200. That's the practical effect of the BRI. And there was another bit on this. And the Pacific. China's been in the Pacific for an awful long time. Right? Belt and Road Initiative. It's sort of like it's supposed to be like holding your pants up or something, isn't it? I mean, that's the...
Well, that's belt and braces.
Belt and braces, right.
I mean, can I come at this point? Yeah. Just on Belt and Road Initiative, in a sense, I would say it's actually got several layers. There is a strategic layer, there's an economic layer, and there's a project layer. And in a sense, they've all been blended together, so people get very anxious about it because sometimes they want to look at the projects in terms of the strategy, or they want to look at the economic cooperation in terms of the projects or whatever. But I think you have to, in a way, disaggregate it to really understand what's going on. I would also just make a comment about your original question about protectionism. I mean, I think it is this is a real issue for this country because we are, in a sense, our standard of living rests on our being successful global traders. I would say, however, we have a free trade agreement with China, which dates from 2008, was upgraded last year. It is completely free. As of 1 January next year, everything that we send to China will be tariff-free. That includes dairy products. Because the safeguards mechanisms, which were built into part of the agreement, will expire on 31 December this year. And that's quite an extraordinary situation. And of course, what it means is that actually China is Fonterra's largest market by a long, long way. And the fact that China agreed to that is something which probably reflects a little bit the evolution of China as a trading partner and a trader in the world, and that it was willing to do something with New Zealand, which it probably wouldn't have been so comfortable doing with other countries. But it did in 2008, 2024 seemed a long way away. Well, it was a long way away, but actually now it's going to be happening in about 9 months' time. So although there are those trends happening, let's not forget that we, New Zealand, have benefited hugely from the demands coming out of the Asian countries for a variety of things that we produce. So in that sense, although, as I would agree that being in the agriculture business is probably not the smartest thing to do, it actually has served us quite well in terms of the demand coming out of the many of those sectors of the population in China and elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it saved us, right? I mean, this was always John Key's thing that our FTA with China was what saved New Zealand. But I just want to, part of part of the point, you know, for people who, I don't think New Zealanders know enough about Asia, and I don't think they know how dependent in some ways we are, right? So if you look at our FTA with Britain, it's okay. If you look at our FTA with the European Union, when it comes to agriculture, there's nothing, right? I mean, all it's done is removed any constructive ambiguity that we had a future in agriculture in Europe. That's gone. Professor Lee mentioned that my last job was Security Council, so Security Council votes are hard to get, 193 countries, and they're tough. New Zealand's strongest support wasn't from Europe, and it wasn't from the Pacific. New Zealand's strongest support was from Asia. That's one of the reasons I took this job, because it means there's something interesting about us. So I suppose what I was trying to throw into that was that economically and politically and securely, there's a whole lot of integration with Asia that I don't see reflected in the body politic here, and I don't see reflected in the discussion, other than we're selling a lot of stuff.
Kia ora. Thank you very much. Wow, we are now coming to an end of our conversation, this part of the conversation. Before I open the floor, my last question is something quite fundamental. What challenges and opportunities does North Asia offer to New Zealand, and how can we maximize this opportunity? And with this big question, I can only give you 2.5 minutes to each to answer. Sorry. Shall we start from John?
Okay, so I'm very good at keeping to 2.5 minutes. But anyway, I mean, I think there is both the economic thing. I think we've sort of touched on that now. I think there's a big opportunity for New Zealand, continuing opportunity in the fact that what we would loosely call middle classes in China and Japan and Korea have an appetite, literally in some ways, for the things we produce, whether that's infant milk formula, whether it's scenery, whether it's English language education, and here in this part of the country, that's some of that's very, very important. But secondly, I think we also have to be alert to what is happening in that region politically and strategically, which doesn't mean that it's necessarily something that we have to go in and grab, but we have to be aware of the issues that are confronting the countries in that region and how we should respond to them.
Right, thank you. Simon?
I would say the opportunity for New Zealand is, by every metric that I've seen, the centre of gravity of almost everything is moving towards Asia. It is the most exciting, dynamic part of the world. It is where the decisions about the future are going to be made. And that's and we can be part of that. That's the other. I think the challenge is that we, New Zealand, are going to have to do the heavy lifting. That we need Asia and North Asia much more than it needs us. And I don't think sort of being smug or the status quo is going to be enough. I think we're going to have to be more active and invest more effort, and we're going to need more New Zealanders understanding the importance of Asia to not just their present but to their future.
Any final thoughts to add?
No.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, John and Simon, for such a stimulating talk over the past hour. Now I would like to open the floor. So here I just want to make two housekeeping announcements. The first one is that we're so keen to actually hear your thought. But at the same time, I would also want to give more time to the speakers to respond to your questions. So please keep your questions or comment concise. And secondly, when you actually raise your question, I want to hear your name and if you have any affiliation where you're affiliated to. All right, shall we start from here?
We can just,
I did listen, I was just going to introduce.
That's all right. We'll use the mic because we're recording this, and so we need to be able to hear properly. So.
Hi, thank you. Good evening, everybody. I've got three observations from reading too much. My name is David Catwood-Ferguson. My knowledge of Asia is that we're in the tourism business and we do quite well in South Asia and China, but not in Korea and Japan. And know nothing about Mongolia. I don't recall having any Mongolian customers. Anyway, three observations. One is the first one's about Kim Fatty IV and the Borgias. Kim's daughter had better watch what she eats because Kim's sister has got to take that country over without any doubt. And if daughter gets in the way, she's a goner, my opinion, not my observation. The thought of China taking on more democratic principles as a result of getting wealthier, you didn't think that was the case, but I would argue that in those late 90s, that was all put to bed with Tiananmen. Because they were definitely going that way, wanting more personal political expressions, but that was trodden on really quite. So can that happen again? I think it does, because so many Chinese are buying Western goods, and that's the aspirational things nowadays. So regardless of voicing political outwardly, they're doing it inwardly by buying Western goods rather than Eastern goods. And the third one is, I think the observation that New Zealand's a rounding error is actually being rather complimentary about New Zealand. I think we're far less relevant than that. And I think it's something that we do have to have far more conversations about. And the big observation that I have is that if you look what we supply China and what China supplies us, if we fall out with China, they don't need one thing we have, whereas we need everything China delivers to us. And that's why I think we've got to have a lot more conversation and to make sure that our diplomatic presence in all these places is ramped up with some decent investment, because we have got no bonds, we have no liens, we have no power over any of these Asian nations.
Thank you. Kia ora. Can I get your name?
It's David.
David, thank you.
But there was no question in that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Challenge.
No, I was just thinking, did I have to respond? But I'll
Challenge your view of our importance.
Yeah.
I think we've got to do even more work.
Right.
Kia ora,
So we
thank you.
have, I have a question now from, yes, Trent. Come out, bring over the mic for you quickly.
I'm not Trent. I'm Eric. Eric Bradshaw from Arrowtown. I'm interested in your views on the BRICS alliance, which to me is predominantly Southeast Asia with Brazil and South Africa tacked onto it. And whether you see the world moving into more of a bipolar mode where you'll have an Anglo-American group based on the SWIFT banking system, and you'll have a BRICS group based on their financial settlement system, and whether New Zealand will be forced to choose a partner. Because currently we're allied sort of politically with an American thing, but actually economically with Southeast Asia, and whether we're going to have to actually make up our mind and choose our friends.
I'll have a crack at that, because I had a discussion slightly similar to this with Queenstownian, is that what you call yourselves? Queenstownian, Rob Fife. So it's about data sets, and it's about artificial intelligence. So if you want to succeed as a company, you're going to need the best data set possible. The more data you've got, the better your AI is going to be, the better you're going to be able to serve your customer, the more likely you're going to succeed. Currently, at this moment, as we speak, there is a massive battle going on between an American-centric data set, a China-centric data set, and an EU data set. And those data sets are not going to be compatible. So in serving your customers, you're going to have to think, what is the data set that you want to be part of? And so, to go to your question, I would say I think there's going to be a fragmentation of some of the universal systems that are like SWIFT and stuff like that. And I think we probably are going to see a multipolar systems that are large enough that a number of countries will be part of, but it won't necessarily talk to the other part. is what I think.
Okay. Before we move to other questions, I just wonder whether we have any. Oh yeah, please.
Student.
Could you? Yeah.
I'll bring over
just
the,
1 second, so that we can have a microphone. Okay.
Just remember to say your name so we know who you are.
That sounds a bit covert, doesn't it? Just say your name so we know who you are. We'll be visiting you later.
Hi, I'm Grace Fremantle and I'm currently year 13 at Wakatipu High School, and my question is, in the context of China's environmental and demographic challenges, what opportunities do you see for New Zealand to work with China on issues such as climate change and sustainable development?
Kara. Actually, that's one of the questions that I had prepared in earlier.
Yeah. Funny that,
John,
yeah. I mean, I think firstly, those are very serious issues for China, generally speaking. I mean, both environmental and demographic ones. Secondly, I would say that those are areas where there is potential and there is some actuality of New Zealand cooperating with China, particularly in the climate change area, where there's been quite a lot of discussion about e-vehicles and the likes of that, but also because in a way, although China's scale, as I said earlier, is hugely different from ours, but some of the challenges they face are actually not too dissimilar. But if you were looking at it also more broadly, if we are going to move into a more, a sort of greener world, then we need China to succeed at that. And so any help we can give or any cooperation we can have will be beneficial from that, from a national point of view, but also internationally as well.
Simon?
Yeah, just to add on to that, two things. Someone who was at Kyoto for the signing of the first protocol, so the real challenge is the fact that many Asian countries, including China, think countries like the West cause this problem, and we should fix it. And it's not, even though they know that they are now the largest emitter. So there's a really tricky who's at fault here sort of stuff. The second thing I'd say is that often when I speak with New Zealanders, there is a prejudice of sorts that they somehow think Asians are not so care about the environment as much as. I remember having this conversation in Korea actually years ago. The young Asian people that we deal with at the foundation are incredibly green, incredibly conscious about sustainability, are very aware of this stuff and really do want to make a change. 50% of the world's EVs are sold in China, right? They are doing massive things to improve their footprint out of their own self-interest. As much as anything. So I would just challenge the idea that, well, not the idea, and you didn't say it, but maybe I'm oversensitive, but, somehow China doesn't care about this stuff. I think they deeply do, and they're going to work on it really hard, as will a lot of other Asian places.
Thank you, Simon. And thank you for raising excellent question for us. This is great. Shall we go for the person in the middle? Yeah, please.
Is it me? My name is Sylvia, and I would love to hear more about the relationship between China and Taiwan. You mentioned initially that you were going to talk about it, so if you please expand, I really need this information for my work. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I'm sure if you need it for your work, I'll be happy to oblige. I mean, there's two areas to this. One is that, of course, this has been something which has been, as I said earlier, starts in 1950 when the Communist Party of China failed to reclaim Taiwan, and ever since then it's had basically a claim to the island of Taiwan as part of China, and countries which have recognised China, as we did in 1972, or recognised the People's Republic, have had to acknowledge in some way, and the formulations do vary, exactly what that means in terms of the status of Taiwan. So that's been a continuing thread. What we have now is a situation in which I guess the prospect of there being some form of action which would be taken to reunify is perhaps higher than it would have been some time ago. At the same time, my personal view, and this is a personal view, is that that's not likely to manifest itself in the immediate future. And part of my my confidence in that, or perhaps my statement about it, is resting not on what Chinese say, but on what Americans say. So that when President Biden came out, I was meeting with Xi Jinping, he said, well, I don't think that anything's going to happen in Taiwan in the near future. Beyond that, though, I would say that the big issue should be for us not about what happens, whether the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives visits Taiwan or not, but what about the people in Taiwan itself? Because this is where you might think if you were sitting in Taiwan, your issue would not be about what happens next year or the year after or the year following, but what happens in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years' time. Well, this is the sort of millennial issue that the younger people here might be more focused on. But if you were a Taiwan person, you were thinking about what's going to happen to your children or your grandchildren, you might have a rather different view. Taiwan, they've lived with this reality for the whole of Taiwan's existence, basically. So they, in a sense, are a little bit inured to a little bit the way that people are in the Republic of Korea vis-a-vis the DPRK. It's just something that's always been part of the landscape. So I suppose the roundabout answer to your question is I don't think that issue's not going away. The status quo is probably as good as you're going to get. But I don't think anything very dramatic is going to happen in the immediate future.
John's forgotten more about Taiwan than I'll ever know, but that won't stop me commenting briefly on what... first of all, we do a Perceptions of Asia and what New Zealanders worry about, and Taiwan has really rocketed up that list, and we're about to release that report probably in the next 3 months, I think. So New Zealanders really worry about Taiwan. I think the biggest thing that's happened in terms of Taiwan for me is Hong Kong, because I think the Taiwanese have looked at Hong Kong and realised that, two countries, one system is not very tenable. I also, and I'm not you're the ex-Secretary of Defence, I think if something does happen with Taiwan, God forbid, I don't think the question's going to be for New Zealand, like who should we be with and what do we do, and I think about how do we survive, because I think it would be catastrophic for New Zealand. Be catastrophic economically, shipping lanes, just practical things. So I sort of think there's the theoretical part, how do we support 20 million people who want democracy, but I think the impact on New Zealand will be very present.
Thank you. There's
look, thank you very much for this really interesting discussion. I'm Roger Somerville, live in Arrowtown. Till recently ran the public policy organisation for Amazon Web Services across Asia. And I think, like many of us in the room, also worked for John once. But look, you both talked about that idea of China as a responsible stakeholder in the world system, sort of the assumption that the West might have had that as China's middle class grew and got apartments and cars, they'd want a political system that allowed them to have some protections around the things they started to own. I'd love if you could perhaps peel or dive into that, or peel a few more layers back on that. Just that idea of, okay, maybe it doesn't look so positive for that long-term change now, but what if you take the time frame further out? Well, maybe it's the 2050s instead of the 2020s. I'd love some thoughts on that.
Well, thank you, Roger. I don't think I'm going to be around the 2050s, but anyway, that's by the by. But I'll pick some point. I think is it David that you made about the trajectory of China. I still myself would be uncertain whether there is an automatic equation, or not an automatic equation, an equation between modernisation, in other words, embracing a modern lifestyle, and willing to buy into a particular set of arrangements. One thing you discover in China is that is that people are they're proud of their country and they're proud of what it does, and in some ways they don't always react in the way that people outside China think they should react. So even over a trajectory going through the 2050s, I wouldn't be confident necessarily that that trajectory is going to mean that China's somehow going to become more like us, whatever us is. Now, that's not exactly what you said, I think, but we need to be thinking about this in terms of not what modernisation means in terms of this is what it's like in Europe or North America or Australia and New Zealand, but what does it mean in terms of China? And maybe actually Republic of Korea or Japan are better indicators of that than what's happened in the parts of the world that maybe we're more familiar with. So one thing which always struck me in China was that people could be very modern and at the same time very Chinese, which sounds a bit patronising and a bit silly, but it's really a way of saying that people could modernise in ways which aren't necessarily congruent with our expectations of what that would be. And I think that that's just basically injecting a note of caution into assuming that there is only one path ahead and that China is going to follow it. In the end, there's going to be some sort of convergence between what happens in that country and what happens in ours. I'm just not sure that that's going to happen. It may. I'm not saying it wouldn't, but I'm not sure that I would say that's the most probable outcome.
Thank you, John.
So
now I think we have a time for just
yes, we have one question.
There's another student.
Why don't we?
One over here.
Oh, there's lots.
Okay, may I suggest that we take
We can do 5 minutes.
another 5 minutes? Okay, all right. David, can we just go and I'll make sure to come back to you? Okay, so why don't we actually hear those 3 questions first? And then let's integrate those questions together and then find a way to actually answer them. Shall we start from there? Just concisely focusing on the question, please.
He's got the mic's over here. So
Start there. Let's get the mic.
I just had actually 15 observations, 3 surmises, and a donut.
And a
just
thesis.
Kidding. How do you look at the potential impact of global trade shift manufacturing to India on China's aspirations and what its alliances might be, and the impacts that would have on North Asia?
Thank you. Yep. The next question.
Thank you, and I can only repeat what has been said elsewhere. This has been fantastic and utterly illuminating. My name's Susan Archer. I live in Queenstown. At the end of January, a couple of senior officials in the US, one military and one political, stated that they believed the US would be at war with China by 2025. Now, it's a provocative statement, and I just really want to know how we should deal with that kind of statement, whether we take it at face value or whether it's part of some international game playing and signalling between nations, because if you take it at face value, it's pretty worrying.
Thank you.
I'm Jared Long, and I'm a Year 12 at Wakatipu High School. So my question is, how far is the extent of China's alliance with North Korea? So say if North Korea attacked a power such as the West or Japan, would China support them?
You were taking notes. So.
I was taking notes. That was obviously a big mistake.
Is it any other questions so far?
Kia ora, and thank you, and sorry to be so cheeky. I just want to bring you back to one of the end questions that we didn't get an answer to, and that was to do with the Pacific.
Yep.
And I haven't spent much time in Asia, but I have in the South Pacific, and there's an innate wariness, particularly from New Zealanders, as to what's happening there. So I think that would be lovely to be addressed. Kia ora, thank you.
And David.
I just want to go back to the environmental question, is that whilst you've said that they're keen on their EVs and their decarbonisation and emissions, that was in their own self-interest. When you look at their environmental policies towards New Zealand, there's a huge amount of hypocrisy. They chop down our trees, releasing the carbon.
No, we chop down our trees.
But we chop down our trees because the massive demand out of China. They buy a load of our milk, which is full of PKE, that's chopping down the trees in Indonesia, and they're bottom dredging our oceans because we've allowed them to. None of these are environmentally positive things. Now, there's some mitigating factors, I would agree, but outwardly, they don't look very environmentally friendly to aim at, but internally.
Thank you, David. So now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5
questions here.
So far.
So I'm going to answer some of them.
Yeah, and then maybe I can ask Simon to.
And we really are sorry Anna's not here because she knows a lot about the Pacific and she would be able to answer your question much more effectively than either I will or I might leave Simon to. But just on the ones that I can deal to. So the first one was about the shift of manufacturing to India and what that means. I mean, I think that is part of a global process that's going on. I think China has demonstrated it's got an ability to retool itself and to rework itself. So that, but from a narrower New Zealand point of view, I don't think it makes that much difference because the things we sell to China are things that they're going to have a continuing demand to. It may alter the nature of what we import from China because if there some more of these goods and clothing and textiles and manufactured goods are produced in South Asia than in China, that may have a difference. But I think there are still going to be things that they produce. So I would have thought it's something that is a challenge, but I think it's a challenge that the Chinese system would be able to respond to. There was a second question about about the statements about the US being at war with China. Well, this is why when I commented earlier on the question about Taiwan, I referred to the fact that there have been other people saying exactly opposite things. And I think there is, in a sense, in which it goes back to that point I was making earlier. When you don't have trust between those two big players, you are going to get a lot of comments and a lot of observations. And there are some pretty sharp ones coming out of Beijing, as well as the ones coming out of Washington, which are alarming for everybody. But, you know, I guess if one was being optimistic, you'd like to think, well, this is a little bit of positioning, you know. So if we talk about this, it's not going to happen. I just read earlier today or yesterday a comment from another US senior military leader who said it's really unhelpful to make these sort of comments. Well, unhelpful is certainly one way of describing it, and I may not be quoting him exactly. But the real issue there is that I think if you're sitting within the military, you have to plan. You know, you have to plan for contingencies and you have to plan for possibilities, even though there are ones you rather hope don't eventuate. So there is a sense in which there's always going to be that sort of element going on. I'm sorry, I'm losing my touch here, but the Chinese alliance with North Korea, would China come to support North Korea if it attacked Japan or the United States? I think that was the thrust of the question. Well, I guess I'd go back and say I really hope North Korea doesn't do that, because if North Korea does do that, I think that would probably be the end of North Korea. Let's be honest. I don't think any of those countries are going to just let that just happen and not react to it. So I think China's view on that is probably going to be, we like North Korea and we like it being there, but at the same time, you know, North Korea should act responsibly in terms of the international order. So you can infer from my observation on that remark how I think China might react, but I would certainly hope North Korea doesn't do anything quite so extreme. I will not answer the question on the Pacific because I feel I don't know much about it, but I would say, as I think was said earlier, I mean, China has a long history there. I think there is a degree of, we've endeavoured to have open lines of communication with China so that we know what they're about and they know what we're about and so on and so forth. But at the same time, the Pacific countries have their own agency, their own rights of decision, so they can choose to do things which we may or may not think are the greatest. But that's an issue of New Zealand relations with those countries as much as New Zealand's relations with China. And I'll leave the environmental argument to be answered by Simon, or the environmental observation, I should say.
Okay, thanks, John. I managed to take notes. I think India, China, I think that's a whole big area about the moving of manufacturing stuff. That's not my area of expertise, but what John said makes sense to me. I mean, I think it's, I don't think it will change our export profile, but may change our import profile. But I think India, China is it's a whole area of study that's fascinating. I want to pick up about Taiwan. What I can say as a diplomat is when we hear these things being said, often the first question we ask ourselves is, who's the audience? And so I think in terms of that, a US military commander, who is he talking to? Is he talking to China? Or is he talking to a budget committee in the US, or is it, and so I think it's always, and I think a real issue for us in New Zealand is we have no foreign correspondent in Asia. So everything that you hear about Asia is from either Australian, American, British, European eyes, right? And so I think I think we need to think hard about, who's the audience. I also just want to say, as an old-fashioned diplomat, the point that John made is, countries don't exist, it's just people, right? That trust element, that's what you look for. So when we look at the US-China relationship from the foundation, we don't, we listen to what Xi Jinping says and Biden, of course, but it's all those others, hundreds of other connections that are happening. And that's why I think, and when they start drying up, that's when people like me start worrying. Because there's a whole lot of polsec, military people, all that. And that's again why I think engagement by people like you is really important, because you are part of New Zealand's relationships with these countries. On the DPRK, I would simply say, and it's something David said too, I don't care about the Kims. I think they're horrible people, and I think if they were wiped off the face of the earth, I wouldn't care. It's the 22 million people who live under them, and I think that we should talk more about them than we should about Kim's daughter or sister or brother, because to me their relevance. I think the only country that can support, if something happened, if they did do something stupid, I think China is the only country that could control it in some ways, that could sort it out. In fact, this is very controversial and it's a personal view and no one agrees with me, but I think the best possible outcome I can see of this wicked problem would be if China annexed North Korea. Because I think that way, in terms of deaths, in terms of China demonstrating it's a grown-up superpower, in terms of what would be palatable, that's the only thing that I can think of. But like I say, it's an opinion of one. On the Pacific, again, we're going into the Pacific to talk about with the Pacific Islanders. I'll make 2 points. New Zealanders talk about the Pacific. We don't mean the Pacific, we mean Polynesia. So, right, we're a Polynesian country. In terms of Māori and Te Ao Māori. So, I think, and 95% of Pacific Islanders are Melanesian, all right, once you take in Papua New Guinea. So I think when we talk about the Pacific, we have to be careful. Micronesia, Melanesia, Polynesia. The other thing I'd say, and it goes back to China, is, and it's something I don't, I struggle with a bit, but China's a rising power. What is legitimate influence of a rising power? What is legitimate that they say, actually, we want to have more drawing rights in the IMF or World Bank? It is, we want to have bases. We want, what's legit and what is illegitimate interference? And I think when we talk about China and the Pacific, there's something about we just think this is illegitimate interference. But, well, because we don't like change and all those sorts of things. But John and I, and many here, are old enough to remember the riots in Tonga in 2005. Where did it happen? Chinatown. I mean, there's a Chinatown, Chinese have been in that part of the world for ages, so that they, go there and engage. I'm surprised that people are surprised that China's in the Pacific.
Thanks, Simon. I feel like I'm stopping the very hot debate in the middle, but unfortunately this is the time, and then I think we can carry on the conversation.